Welcome to The East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
Hello and welcome to an unusual episode of The East Angle. Unusual because we, with Ra, aren't in the same room for the first time in a long time, because due to research and other commitments, Ra is in a much sunnier and much nicer place than I am. It's currently 2 degrees Celsius outside in Norwich. It is not very pleasant to go for a walk, but Ra tells me that not only did he go for a walk, but he also swam in the sea. Ra, over to you. Can you tell us, our listeners, where you are and what you're doing there?
Yes, thanks, Sherzod. I'm over here in Okinawa. I did indeed swim in the sea. It was a little bit cold, like a nice hot British summer's day when it's maybe 20-something outside and teeny something in the sea. So, yeah, I had to steely myself up and dive into this deep blue and green coral-filled ocean. But I managed to make it back somehow and still feeling
terrible.
okay.
Sounds terrible. Even on a hot summer day in England, you will probably get. I mean, it's as good as that. On a.
It's definitely as good as that.
Yeah.
I think it might be a tiny bit better. Yeah, I'm over here actually adding to some of the research that I did for the book that I've just published on Okinawa and Great Power Competition, with Okinawa as the keystone in the Pacific. And, it's fascinating to be over here because it is always glorious to come back to Okinawa. But every time you come back, you see small changes, and you see all the problems that are facing this, what could be a paradise island, what could really be what people call the Hawaii of Japan.
No one doubts that it's a paradise. But what do you notice? Because you are someone who goes to Okinawa regularly. You probably, regularity might not be such a good thing in this case, because if you go too frequently, you will probably not see some of the contrast. But then at least, like, looking around, what do you see has changed in Okinawa since your last visit? But overall in Japan, what is going on? What was the first thing that struck you?
Well, I mean, in Japan per se, it's actually the first time I've been back in Japan for a year. And what struck me more than anything was, I would say, probably 2 or 3 things, but the indifference was quite striking, actually.
Indifference to what?
Indifference, I think, more than anything, to what's going on in the world around, what's going on in the region, and also to a certain extent, indifference towards foreigners. There are far more foreigners now in Japan than there have ever been, really. And, you go into convenience stores or construction sites or wherever, and a lot of the people that you meet face to face are now foreign.
Even in Okinawa.
And it's created including in Okinawa. And Okinawa particularly has a very warm and welcoming culture. And I have to say that being back here this time, there's lots of things that have struck me. Obviously, things going on with the military, things going on in society, things going on in the environment. And we're joking about the ocean, but that's probably the biggest thing. I mean, in just a year, I can visibly see the coral dying in my local beach here in Nago, which is really sad. I can see extra huge chunks of concrete and cranes and ships have been added to the new base that they're building at Henoko. These are very physical, powerful things. But on a more social level, it is striking to me the indifference. I can't think of a better word for it. There probably is one. But it's this feeling that rather than being this, odd but very welcomed alien being, there's just an indifference towards foreigners, towards the world around. And I think this is a whole combination of different cultural factors, but it's quite striking on Okinawa because it is such a special and warm and welcoming culture and has always been, especially
That's
for me.
that's very interesting. Can I ask what the Okinawans, if not the whole Japanese people, think about Trump? I mean, do you? I mean, maybe like a conversation in a coffee shop, in the bar, in the combini, anywhere. Did you
Yeah,
have a chance to discuss all of that with the local people?
yeah, it's divisive, So on Okinawa, you have mixed feelings about Trump, like in many parts of the world, but compared to somewhere like, say, China, where there is a lot of surprisingly perhaps, a lot of pro-Trump feeling and sentiment, because there is this idea that Trump is a disruptor against
Hmm.
the imperial Americans, and that he is not trying to go to war with China. So even though he might lump these huge tariffs on and commit economic warfare, he's seen as somebody that ultimately China can trust, at least among large sections of the population. On Japan, there's much more or on Okinawa, I should say, and in Japan, there is much more wariness towards Trump. But on Okinawa, there's this issue, this two-part issue. On the one hand, people feel like Trump might actually try and reduce the amount of military that there are on the islands. But on the other hand, they know that he's going to push and try and make the Japanese taxpayer, and specifically Okinawans, pay more for the bases that they already host here.
Hmm.
So that definitely
He
creates a little
he
bit
wants
of yeah,
Yeah, he wants
I mean,
everybody to pay. He wants
yeah, he just,
uh
yeah,
yeah, I mean, how likely that, or how whether he succeeds in getting other people to pay up, like some of the demands that he's putting out on Twitter now, or X as you call it, is some of those actually just sound very unrealistic. Speaking of X, over here in Britain, I think you probably did witness some of that while you were still here. In late December, starting from late December up until now, the whole cultural wars thing is heating up again, or at least some people are trying to kind of bring it up and heat it up. Of course, speaking of X, none other than the X's owner, Elon Musk, has been, you know, um, how should I put it nicely? Okay, has been questioning or criticizing the British government for the handling of certain things. I think some of his tweets go a lot farther than just simply criticizing, but then he's, for example, talked about the so-called grooming gangs, in some parts of Britain, and I think he's been using some dramatic language, such as the rape of Britain, etc. And this is one thing that a lot of people ask me, because I live in Britain. Lots of people from back home, or from people who are quite curious but aren't really, they don't really know what's going on. And for me, it's I mean it's and I, I don't really know how long we want to spend on this, but this is something that is like that's a it's a very controversial question. There's lots of misinformation. There's a lot of maybe even conscious disinformation from some parties. You and I know that the current prime minister, who is coming under attack from specifically from Elon Musk, actually had a big part to play in prosecuting these gangs. But I think we need to also kind of consider the whole thing in its complexity. And one way to do that would be to consider some of the things that happen in Japan, and maybe kind of have a comparative outlook, especially if you're British and you really want to understand why, or how, or I think
yeah,
contrasting, comparing with Japan. So
yeah. I mean, I think there's absolutely, it's actually a very illustrative case, the Japanese case, to shine a little bit of objectivity on what's gone down in particularly the case of the grooming gangs, but maybe cultural wars more broadly. And that's one example that really kind of illustrates this, because you have a situation in the UK where particularly those on the right are seeking to project the idea that grooming gangs are the result of Muslim men
hmm,
congregating in some kind of culturally isolated way, who have failed to integrate into British society and are then targeting young white girls. But this is a misrepresentation, really, of the core of the problem,
Or
where what you
oversimplification.
actually,
Yeah.
yes, certainly a
Yeah.
simplification. It's
Yeah.
certainly a simplification. And if you look at the what you might describe as rape culture in Japan, certainly the sexualization of young girls, is a serious social problem, and it has very little to do with religion or a lack of integration. You're talking about a situation. This is not to say that there aren't cultural issues and problems in Britain and problems of integration. There certainly are. But the example of Japan certainly gives you a bit more of a sense of perspective on this, because you have a situation where the vast majority of the Japanese population is ethnically and to a large extent religiously homogenous, comparatively speaking. So you're talking, but you still have this human phenomenon of vulnerable young women and girls being targeted by groups of coordinated men. And
So
this
you can talk
goes
about
right to the
groups because you use the phrase rape culture. So we're not talking about individual assault or
well, I'm talking
individual
about one
abuse.
aspect. Yeah, I'm talking about one aspect of Japanese society, which definitely involves the sexualization of particularly young girls and women, and the targeting of them by very unpleasant sectors of society, mostly by men, right? And I mean, this has gone right to the top. When you think of things like the Waseda University Rape Club, where you actually had an organized club, as in like a club and society of a university, at one of the highest ranking universities in the country, in fact in the region. I'm talking about a university that produces Japanese prime ministers, top civil servants, one of the absolute elite universities, actually having a club that involved grooming and gang raping mostly vulnerable young first year girls who'd come from the countryside and were ill-equipped or lacked the experience or understanding to sort of defend themselves.
It's fascinating.
This,
Yeah, sorry, go on. Finish your
well, I mean,
thought.
it's illustrative of the fact that this happens across the board. And actually, if you
Yeah.
go back to the British case briefly, you have there's lots of cases where girls were groomed not by Muslim grooming gangs,
Yeah.
but by other ethnicities or by so-called indigenous sectors of the population. So there's obviously a problem here that goes way beyond
Absolutely.
the integration of immigrants.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that this is being made into this it's being blown into an issue of, this is the failure of multiculturalism, this is the Muslims raping white people, obviously kind of stoking the fire of hatred. And obviously the people who committed those heinous crimes, they should be, they have been prosecuted, and they should get feel the full force of the law. But I think the point that you made about homogeneity in Japan, and the fact that these things happen usually by perpetrated by male individuals or groups, by males, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion, regardless of whether they're well integrated into society or not, should, I think, bring us back. And I think the case that you presented really kind of drives home that message very well. We should kind of step back and look at maybe more invisible ways in which abuse and rape happens, maybe the more invisible or maybe kind of not conspicuous ways. For example, the statistic that's been bandied about is, and I think that statistic is quite eye-opening in the sense that every time when a right-wing person, or say Elon Musk or somebody else, brings up the question of Muslims raping the white girls, the emphasis on the religion or ethnicity is there to send a certain message, while in fact more than 80% of all rape cases were by white as you say, indigenous population. So again, I mean, bringing up that statistic again focuses on ethnicity, which we shouldn't do, as you say. We should kind of take two steps back and talk about maybe institutional and discrimination, maybe some of the things, some of the institutions, or some of the traditions. Yeah.
Education, I think, as well, is so important. I mean, and I should, of course, qualify, the case of the Waseda University Rape Club to say that this obviously isn't an officially sanctioned club, but in reality, it was for several years operating as a club, hidden, and that is also very much an element, I think, of different forms of education. I mean, we have serious problems here in Japan. Certainly in the UK, I can't think of many great examples. As ever, we often go back to Scandinavia to look for some of the better examples. But you have environments, in educational environments, that suppress, learning about sexuality, learning about, gender, learning about power. These things are not talked about in an open and effective way, and our kids are not being given an education that might allow them to see some of the darker sides to human behavior and avoid them and actively counter them, be they male, female, or any other gender. And so that really, I think, is the root cause. I think, like you said, the institutions come from the educational base.
Yeah. I mean, institutions in the broadest possible sense. I'm not pointing fingers to specific institutions, but even if you go beyond, even if you go broader, like if you just consider Japanese society, there have been social issues that make certain forms of exploitation or abuse a bit more, not likely, but maybe easier to come by. Yeah. For example, I've been reading this fascinating book by Akiko Takeyama, who is a Japanese historian of, or not a historian strictly speaking. I mean, for me, everybody is a historian as a historian, anthropologist who works on Japan, and the book is called Involuntary Consent. It's about the Japanese AV, adult video industry, and the exploitation of people. And when you look at the cover and when you read the subtitle, you might think this is specifically about that industry. But if you dig a bit deeper, you can see bigger questions about precarity, bigger questions about labor exploitation, the fact that people are driven into certain conditions, specifically in this case, young women who work in that industry. In which, it's very hard to defend yourself. You have agreed into like some form of, exploitation, and from which you really find it very difficult to get out. I don't want to really drag this question, but what you just said, what I mean is, like, overall in society, for example, the probably the best known kind of problem, that best known in the sense that lots of foreigners also know about this, is chikan. I don't know, how do we translate chikan?
Perverts in trains, mostly perverts on trains, or perverts in buses and trains, who kind of touch. This is a very strange phenomenon, right, that you don't get in a lot of countries to the same extent. Like there's, like, it's of course like molesting people occurs in every country, but to actually have it as a social phenomenon
on the public transportation.
I mean, this is
which the Japanese government and the train companies have tried to counter by designating usually the first car in the train is a female-only train at certain intervals during the day. Obviously, every station you have these massive posters, usually driven in the kind of manga style. Groping is a crime or is a criminal offense. Chikan wa hanzai desu, something like that. And I mean, I don't know how effective that is, but overall, I think takes us back to the point about probably not so much of a multicultural issue.
Well, I mean, and I think the thing is, Japan in particular is going to bump up against all kinds of issues across the board, because going back to the point of exploitation, the education system and society at large is just not set up at the moment. And you know this as well as I, it's not set up to rapidly integrate And this kind of throws it back actually to the reverse of what we were just talking about. But if we think of Britain as a problem case of multiculturalism, Japan is staring down the barrel at an equally troubling scenario, right? For lots of other reasons, one of which being exploitation, not just, in fact, I would say less about sexual exploitation in this case, and more about the exploitation based on kind of ethnic grounds and on, power relations, where you have a disempowered, poorly paid immigrant workforce, which is increasing in Japan,
and it will increase.
Which is going to will increase and will definitely cause the kinds of social issues that we associate everywhere else in the world with immigration, but will come up against this kind of institutionalized prejudice and exploitation. And we're already seeing that. I mean, people like David Slater and others at Georgia University at Sophia in Tokyo work on some of this stuff. But we see the abuse of cheap immigrant labor. We see a whole different legal schema for different sections of different kinds of immigrants. We see people, like in the case of COVID, where suddenly a whole workforce becomes disposable. They're effectively sent home and in one sense expelled and so on. So this is something that Japan is really going to have to grapple with, and you'd think that it will look around, hopefully, and look at some of the models that have been more successful rather than less, because I think this is going to be a huge problem.
Yeah, we spoke in the last episode about maybe a little bit rosier outlook for the Japanese economy, despite all the criticism of both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves more recently. I think UK economy is also looking up, at least compared to the other G7 countries. I think IMF yesterday talked about UK economy growing at a very, very low, comparatively low, 1.6%. But that 1.6% is still very good for Britain, especially considering the whole context. So maybe, again, like if we think about how 2025 is going to pan out for Japan and for Britain, do you think we can still be a bit more optimistic?
Well, we can be optimistic, but I think that's the thing. Growth is such a myth, right, in so many ways for the average person on the street. If you're a poor immigrant working in Okinawa from Indonesia, and you're relying on the crap wage that you're being paid to send back to your family for them to live, then yes, it's true, the fact that there's going to be minimal growth might help you to stay in a job, but it's not going to help you if you're getting beaten up by the boss and you're not
maybe
able
lower
to...
inflation. Is inflation, like, how do you, like, are the prices looking okay in
inflation
Japan?
It's relatively stable. It never really reached the levels that we saw post-Ukraine invasion in Western Europe. But the point is just to say that, I don't think growth is going to save people from structural violence, right? This is something that, and this is not for me to sit here and bash Japan. I love, obviously love Okinawa.
You should bash Japan. That's partly our jobs.
I think it's certainly our jobs to point out some of the issues, because I feel like everybody at the moment is kind of grappling around. They're worrying about Trump coming back into power in the United States, the tariffs he's going to impose on Japan, or the tariffs he's going to put on China. Some of this stuff, and in a kind of from a lived experience point of view, is relatively minor compared to the kind of day-to-day problems that are being faced. And I think, Japan, because it's such a generally peaceful society and has extremely low crime rate, you can go about your daily business and mostly enjoy great food, some beautiful scenery.
Make me jealous, yeah. Go into the sea in the middle of January.
Well, yeah, I'm struggling to make it seem that bad, right? But there is a darker side to this culture and this society, and it should really be being dealt with now rather than 5 years' time when there are 4 times more immigrants.
I agree. Some of the points, or maybe some of the doubts that, say, big reports by you can look at say consulting agencies, or you can look at IMF reports, or if you read those things, you can see that maybe the biggest concern that those reports in general, not across the board, but in general have about the G7 countries' prospects in 2025 is that instability. They talk about instability as the biggest, that dark um, thing that is basically just lurking in the background, because otherwise economically I think both Japan and the UK, obviously nobody knows what Trump will bring to the table, but then uncertainty, political uncertainty, and instability. And so finally, just to kind of wrap this whole talk about whether Japan and Britain will sink further down or will keep their noses above water. Can you say that political instability in Japan has been resolved?
Yeah, I would actually, and
Okay.
I know I like to say things in an absolute way. I would get bashed for this at the very places that you and I work. We're not supposed to say anything in absolute terms. And of course, there's nothing absolute. It's not entirely resolved, but relatively speaking, yes. If you think a couple of months ago, we sat and chatted on the podcast about how Ishiba was overseeing a minority government, and the LDP was facing its biggest crisis since it lost power in 2009. Yeah, relatively speaking, Ishiba is steering in a fairly stable way, surprisingly so, in many respects. And it may not be that he holds on to the premiership for that long, but leadership changes in Japan are often over exaggerated. That's because we tend to look at them from outside of Japan, either in a very Western centric view in our case, or perhaps with other kinds of centric views, from depending on where you're looking at it from. But Japanese leadership is relatively irrelevant in terms of the ship of Japan Inc. You have this iron triangle between big business, the ruling party, and the bureaucracy, and there are many actors, even compared to other countries where leadership is often over exaggerated. In Japan's case, it really is very often the case that the prime minister is simply a figurehead for the general structure of Japanese leadership.
I have to say, Ra, I was actually quite surprised by the show of leadership. You will have seen this speech and this whole, fracas about Nippon Steel trying to take over U.S. Steel. And President Biden, one of his last decisions, he actually he stopped that from happening. He actually didn't let Nippon Steel take over U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel both were protesting. Obviously, they will, because they're businesses, and they still are. But what really surprised me is the very firm and actually quite a strong worded message by Ishiba.
But that's illustrative of the people that back Ishiba. That's not an illustration of Ishiba being a powerful leader and having a great personality.
No, of course not.
It's an illustration of the fact that Japan has had it up to here with the US, pushing, frankly, what was a totally ridiculous blocking of that. Yeah. Even the people within US Steel wanted it to happen by majority. It was pure political maneuvering.
Yeah, which if Biden is doing this again, this might be a harbinger of what Trump. I mean, obviously, what Trump will bring is going to be much worse in terms of economic nationalism, if we talk in broader terms. And we can't really talk too much about this, but I just to put my own kind of 5 cents into the mix is I feel a little bit optimistic, especially because some of the unexpected Japanese successes, for example, Sony of all, like this ailing giant for a long time is actually having record profits through gaming. And we talked about the number of tourists in our last episode, in the Christmas episode. Now we have the definitive final number: 37 million overseas visitors in 2024, which is an absolute record, which smashes the previous record of about 31 million in 2019. Obviously, cheap yen, you could probably explain that with the cheap yen, but there is something else going on. So, again, going back...
It's much easier to come to Japan. But actually, I mean, picking you up on that gaming point, this is another thing that we just don't realize. I mean, you and I are old men now, and, like, I'm sorry to say it, but our kids come over here. My kid comes over here. The way in which he instantly integrates back into society is the fact that they're all playing the same online games.
Maybe we should
These
bring them
things,
into the. So, for the listeners' sake, Ra and I, we both have 14-year-olds, boys, both of them, and they are good friends. They've known each other since they were, what, six,
three or
seven?
four, right? Because,
Or
well, yeah,
even
certainly,
earlier,
yeah,
yeah.
because
So
infant school, yeah,
they're very similar age, almost, I think, about less than 2 months
yeah, about
difference
2 months
between
apart,
them,
right?
and
Yeah.
they go to the same school in Norwich. So maybe talk about gaming, we might actually rely on their expertise. Go on.
It's true, yeah, it's true more than ours. But it's so striking. I mean, we're talking about massive multi-billion-dollar industries, and we're talking about, gamers who are making more money than top footballers.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And maybe the salvation for the Japanese economy lies in that, in not in massive, electronics, or I mean, obviously car industry is still quite strong, but maybe in some niche and specific industries which require specific Japanese, expertise or traditional kind of advantage. For example, oh, this, like I like to mention this all the time. For example, if you ride a bike, if you have a bicycle, you are likely to have Shimano gears, which produces, I don't know what, like the biggest percentage of bicycle gears, gear shifting equipment, etc. If you have a piece of clothing with a zipper, it's likely to be from YKK. It's a Japanese company, and any other companies, like most of that Japanese kind of specific uh, equipment or
Specialization,
parts
yeah.
specialization is invisible, because in every mobile phone, in every laptop, there will be parts that are made by the Japanese companies. So, well, we will continue to observe how the Japanese companies do on the global markets. But I think now, speaking of gaming, now is probably a good time to talk about not gaming, but a game which we both love.
The most
Um,
important game, I would
the
bet.
most important game for us. I mean, there will be
And you're talking
among.
about prospects. How are your prospects in this particular
Oh,
game?
yes, most definitely. I mean, not my prospects individually are non-existent, but we can talk about the teams that we support, or some of the incoming players into
Yes,
the leagues.
interesting incoming players. And who do we have
Yes.
in particular?
So this is a historic incoming. Obviously, as we are recording it, it's not fully finalized yet. He hasn't been photographed with the manager holding up a sky blue shirt. Oh, how I wish that shirt was not sky blue but red. But the first Uzbek player to hopefully to play in the Premier League, has now joined Manchester City. His name is Khusanov. I think in English they will Abdukodir Khusanov is the correct pronunciation. Anybody who needs, I mean, BBC or ITV or Sky Sports commentators, please come and ask me how to pronounce his name, because
They're
I
all going to
think
be calling him Kusanov.
yeah, Kusanov will be the name, which is not correct. But anyway, whatever. My students, I always correct my students when they say Khrushchev.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not the easiest name to pronounce, but Abduqadr Husanov is reportedly now a Manchester City player, and he will be the first Uzbek, so he will go down in history as the first Uzbek to play in the English Premier League.
And playing for the current champions, albeit that they won't be champions this year.
Doesn't look
So
like it,
what give
does it?
us does it? Give us an insight into what sort of a player he is.
He's an incredibly strong, very dynamic centre back. I think when he comes, is he a centre back, or I think he plays on the right of defense. I mean,
Hmm.
I will confess I haven't watched too many games with him. Most of the games I've watched with him are obviously the Uzbek national team playing, because that's the only other
Yeah.
team that I support besides Manchester United. But for I think one season he's played in the French club Lens, and I think they're turning a massive profit on him. I don't know how much Man City will be paying, but it's like in the
Yeah. Yeah.
order of like maybe at least 20 times what they paid to this Belarusian club where he previously played.
Right.
So
Yeah.
he's obviously, despite all the problems the Man City are facing, you will trust Pep Guardiola when it comes to picking the right players, and then not just picking them and bringing them in, but also developing them.
Yeah,
So it will
yeah.
be very, very interesting to see how Husanov develops, how he plays. I think it will be tough. I mean, he's good, but it will still be some form of, there will be a learning curve for him. English football, everybody, even the best players from other leagues come and they're amazed how fast the pace is, how much pressure there is. And in any given game, and again, as a Manchester United supporter, I can attest to that. You can go play against Nottingham Forest, or I mean Nottingham Forest especially in this season, but Bournemouth or even Southampton,
Yeah,
which is the
yeah. Speaking of
bottom
Bournemouth,
team. Yeah,
I mean, Bournemouth, mid-table Premier League team. The gap now is so massive. So we played Bournemouth. This is West Brom in the cup last week. We lost 5-1. We scored first, and it was all going okay. Made a mistake. They equalised, and then they just hit us with four counter-attacks basically, and every time they came forward, they just scored. And it
if
was
it
just
makes
like you
if
could
it
do that in the championship, and we might have conceded one or two, but it's like four chances, four goals, and that's Bournemouth. You
Ra,
know,
Bournemouth or not, if it makes you feel better, Bournemouth actually beat us at Old Trafford.
yeah. I mean, they're a good team. They are a
So
good team, but
I mean,
the
and look at
gap is
what
huge.
Forest are doing. You
Yeah,
know
yeah,
what? I
exactly.
would like Forest to be champions of England. Why can't we have another fairy tale story like in 2015-16 when Leicester won it? Yeah, I
I
mean,
think it'd be nice to see Newcastle.
it will be
I
very,
mean,
very
Forest
hard.
back in the day used to win it regularly. It would be really nice to see Newcastle. And I know people say, "Oh yeah, but it's just like load of Saudi money." But I think anyone that's
It's not
listened to,
just load of
you know,
Saudi money. I think Eddie Howe is. I mean, you have persuaded me. I used to think that Eddie Howe is probably just, he's just an average kind of mid-table coach, but he's showing that he's actually a lot more than that. So it's not just
yeah,
Saudi money. When you talk about money, everybody talks about how Man United have spent 400 million or how Arsenal have spent 400 million. Well, Man City spent whatever they want. They just signed Erling Haaland on a 9.5 year contract. And they can buy anyone. They can just like even in January, I think they're buying three players besides giving Haaland a new contract. So money will always be there. I think unless the British football authorities actually do something about it, these state-owned clubs,
yeah.
Newcastle and City,
Well, I
and
think, but isn't the new aren't the new rules though making this all quite kind of controversial, because don't they effectively, I haven't really looked at them in detail, but these financial fair play rules, don't they effectively actually kind of consolidate the wealth of the top clubs? In other
of
words,
course
the,
they
the
do.
players,
Yeah,
those, yeah, right. I mean,
yeah,
so those top
and
clubs, they can buy.
there is this huge gap between EFL, which actually looks after the leagues from Championship down. I think how many leagues are there? Championship, League
Well,
One,
you've got
League
League One, League
Two,
Two,
and
you've
then
got
two more
EFL, because
leagues. Yeah, so
oh, National
five.
League, yeah, National
Yeah,
League, yeah. So
five leagues or four leagues below the Premier League are actually run by EFL.
yeah.
And championship is really good. Maybe you could probably compare the level of the championship or even the wealth of the championship to some of the national leagues even in Europe.
Oh, easily,
However, the
easily.
Premier League is so far ahead like in every respect, in terms of money, in terms of quality, in terms of the demands, in terms of the outreach, in terms of the broadcasting cash that they get in, they
Oh, completely.
rake
Yeah,
in. So it's incredible. It's incredible even the gap between very good Championship League in England and the Premier League. It's just crazy, the
yeah.
the
I mean,
amount
look
of
at
money.
Southampton.
Yeah,
Southampton are bottom of the Premier League again. FA Cup. Forget who they played. Somebody in the Championship demolished them easy, and they looked way better. And if you look at the bottom of the Premier League, it's all the teams that came up last year from the Championship. Top of the Championship is all the teams that came down from the Premier League. It's
yeah,
become
and it,
like a
and
golf.
obviously it will be easier for them, like because they're parachute payments, which are for a team like yours who have been in the championship for a long time, parachute payments are I don't know, probably
Hey.
stop. I'm sorry.
Not that long, mate.
I'm not saying. I mean, no, not for. I mean, yeah. Sorry. What? How many? Like 4 or 5 years?
So So yeah, it's about. It's,
You know
yeah, it's
what? We
fine.
might
We no
join
longer,
you
you're
in the
right.
championship
We no
next
longer get
season.
the.
If anything, we
Well,
might
Tottenham might.
join.
You
No,
and
Man
Tottenham could get
United. Man
relegated.
United. We were 14th. We just through this heroic hat trick by Ahmad, we just
What a
crawled
player!
back
What a
up.
player!
That
You
was an
lucked out
amazing
there.
game. But then, if you watch the game itself, it was absolutely, shameful for the first 80 minutes. Anyway, um, again, no, I didn't intend to slight you on West Brom, but I only want to say that parachute payments stop after some time,
They do. Yeah, it's
which
hard.
is again just an example of how powerful Premier League is, exerting an influence even on some of the championship clubs, and how hard it is sometimes even for really good clubs like your club, or for example Sheffield United or Sunderland have been in the championship much longer than you guys, and Sunderland are doing well
No, they
now
were in
in
League One. They were in League
League
One.
One. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, they got relegated. Remember Sunderland Till I Die? Anyone that hasn't
yeah,
watched that on Netflix, you've got to watch that. It's
yeah,
hilarious.
yeah.
But it's
And
yeah, cautionary
even if
tale.
just shows how good the Premier League level is, because Southampton, I think, well, I don't know much about how Southampton did in the last season in the championship, but I know how Burnley basically breezed through the championship and qualified automatically with a massive handicap, and they were one of the worst Premier League teams in the next Premier League season, and they were relegated.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
English football is going to be really interesting again this season. Who is going to be champion for you in the
Liverpool.
Premier League?
Sorry to say it. Sorry to say it. I can't see it
Well,
beyond Liverpool because
the-
Arsenal will probably push them fairly close, but it's between
Liverpool
those
have
two, isn't it?
Liverpool haven't really played well in the last month, which gives us hope sometimes. Well,
I like that
yeah,
phrasing.
probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I will probably buy Nottingham Forest shirt or something, but it's not good. Yeah, it probably will be Liverpool unless Arsenal. But Arsenal are in deeper trouble. Arsenal have now lost their striker to knee injury, which basically Jesus isn't going to play this season again, and I don't think Arteta will buy a striker. I mean, even if he had the money, he's somehow reluctant to buy a striker, which lots of Arsenal fans don't like. So
I think he was
no,
going to come in for Josh Maja at West Brom, but he got a niggle, didn't he? So yeah.
no, Josh Maja was a great
Otherwise,
player. I think last time we watched at Hawthorns, I think he scored a goal.
he scored.
So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think yeah.
Well,
Well. We can only just continue.
we can only hope. We can only
We
hope.
can
We can
only
only
hope.
hope that we all sign the next brilliant young Japanese player. Who
Yeah.
will come and save our teams. That's what we need.
Yes.
I would
Exactly.
certainly be up for that. And maybe we
Exactly.
can discuss that on the next podcast. Actually, is the increasing influx of Japanese players and the amazing standards that they're reaching.
Absolutely. To speak of influx, I think it is correct, but influx maybe we need to qualify and say into the Premier League, because Japanese players have long played. Traditionally, there have been lots of Japanese players in the Bundesliga.
True.
There have been some really good players, Japanese players in the Belgian league, in the Netherlands and other parts, but mostly Bundesliga.
Scotland.
Scotland, yeah, Scotland. In the Celtic often had lots of some legends also, but yes, it's good to. So we played Southampton our last league game, and Sugawara was quite good actually. He's made some mistakes since he moved to Southampton. You can't say it's been all great for him, but there are other Japanese players like Mitoma and others who've actually been really really good. And we play
Oh God, yeah,
Brighton.
yeah,
Our next game is against Mitoma's Brighton. So yeah,
yeah. Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, he's a particularly bright spot. But I mean, it's really interesting actually chatting to football people here as well. And it's taken a long time, but you and I have talked about it before and kind of disagreed on it, but I think we probably both agreed that there is some kind of inferiority complex because of Japan's not so glamorous history in international football, but that is slowly fading with the increase of players going abroad and the success they're having, and the fact that the national team now consistently makes it into the or makes it out of the group stages of the World Cup. You're finally beginning to see that filter through to the school level and the club level here.
By far the strongest team in AFC, in the Asian Football Confederation. They have been, and it's not as easy as it sounds. Well, people who don't necessarily follow Asian football might think, oh, it must be a walk in the park. It isn't. Australia now play also in the AFC. Very strong team, lots of Premier League players. Well, look at Chris. Chris Wood is New Zealander, sorry. But look,
New Zealanders are
so many,
many. That famous Aussie Chris Wood.
No, well, sorry. This is my bad. But historically, Australia has been really strong in the Premier League. So and there are other teams. Saudi Arabia, you know what's happening with football in Saudi Arabia. Iran have been really strong. South Korea. So of all those teams, my national team, Uzbekistan, has been missing out most of the time because there are some really good teams, despite the fact that we now also have a Premier League player. So Japan is doing really well, and it will continue to do really well. And hopefully, long may that continue, because as football fans, I would like Japan or Japanese national team to do well.
Me too. And on that very positive note, I think we should wrap up this.
We should wrap up. Please
international podcast.
Yes, please like us. This is truly international. Hopefully next episode will be, Ra and I will be in the same room. But please like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. We would love your comments also and suggestions. And we will see you in the next one. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ra.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Sherzod. Bye.
This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA media production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.